Well, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having us. This is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Thank you, Gardner Foundation. My name is Dr. Rishay Hines. I get the honor of being a fellow with the Gardner Institute. It's an honor that I get to work with a variety of different institutions on a variety of different topics. So thank you for giving us a brief hour today so we can discuss authentic assessment. I think our lens in which we'll present it will be one that is fresh and eye-opening, and I'll allow my co-presenters to present themselves. Dr. Das.
Hey, this is Bikash. I am at the University of North Georgia Gainesville campus, and I teach mathematics, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the G2CD design program. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to share some of the good works that my team and we have done here at the University of North Georgia. So I'm excited.
Hello, I'm Irvin Briones. I'm from Middle Georgia State University, and I teach psychology, and we were part together with another colleague, so there were two of us. We're part of cohort 1 that started in September 2017. So I'll be sharing some of the data that we have collected, some of the assessments that we have made, especially in what is called indirect assessment. So Dr. Hines is going to explain a little bit more about that, and then we'll jump in.
Well, great. Well, thank you both. So I'll give you just some flow, as my colleagues mentioned, is I'll provide a high-level overview, then we'll get into specific case studies from work that happened in terms of assessment on their campuses, and then I'll come behind and summarize, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. So a little bit about myself. I'm an ecological community psychologist by training, with the education background. So I always like to think about person-environment fit, or unit of analysis and environment fit. And from an assessment standpoint, assessment happens in the context of what happens in our institutional needs, strategic needs in our institutions. So within that context, we have our strategic priorities, we have our student success goals, we have to think about our revenue streams, we have to think which aligns to our enrollment mix, which talks about our financial implications, we have to use analytics. And in this particular, contextualizing it for this presentation, we have to think about data and how assessment drives student learning and institutional learning on our campuses. In that way, the foundation of that is data. Data is everywhere. So how do we refine our data? How does our data shape what's happening? How do we detect patterns? How do we insights, right? And most importantly, how do we automate our decisions and our decision-making process? And I think, given the examples of what we heard from our colleagues in the last presentation, is that data became really critical if we think about, the needs of how do our students learn if they don't have technology to learn, right? From a course perspective, we had to think about how do we shift courses that we had traditionally taught face-to-face to an online environment, and then how did that happen? And most importantly, how is that all contextualized that we are in a pattern that we are doing what's best for our students? And the reason that all that data is important is because data are the currency. If we aren't using our data, if we aren't using our assessment data to think about learning, then we aren't serving our institutions well, and most importantly, we aren't serving our students to the best of our ability so that they meet the outcomes they want to at the institutions. Right? And the issue is that we understand that data and the use of data often happens under our traditional institutional issues. On most campuses, there's a reluctance to use data. A lot of times at the institutions I've worked at, decisions are often made on myths. A lot of data is outdated and inaccessible, and oftentimes there's a lack of transparency or consistency with how we're sharing and using our data. Right? And in particularly, when we think about assessment and authentic assessment, how is that done for assessing student learning? Right? So I would say, authentic assessment, in this definition is shared from the University of Indiana. Authentic assessment requires that students have learned in a new situation. And I would morph this definition to say given what we've faced over the last 6 to 8 months, that not only students had to learn in new situations, but our institutions had to learn in new situations, and our courses had to be learning in new situations, right? And most importantly, if we go to the last line of that, it involves real world audiences or stakeholders, and we were those clients and stakeholders at the institutional level, as well as our students and as well as society, and thinking about assessing learning in that changing environment. Right. And I argue, and being I think assessment is live and ongoing. I added the third bullet this morning in saying that assessment of student learning occurs with the student as unit of analysis, where we're thinking about what the student is learning and how that applies to real world applications. Assessment of student learning applies with the course as a unit of analysis. Again, this in the spring semester, we all had to shift courses that were traditionally taught on face-to-face to think about how student learning would occur in a hybrid or online environment. And then this last bullet, we had to think about assessment in terms of learning of how it impacts the institution. So as an institution, given an example that I thought was powerful in the last session is that, if we can have a stellar student, but if they had a digital divide and they were going into the McDonald's parking lot, could we truly think about them being successful in doing student learning? So how as an institution do we assess the digital needs, support our students so that our courses can be successful and that student learning can actually occur within our institutions? Right. And all that happens in our common assessment cycle. And again, over the last 6 to 8 months, this was a real and alive cycle. So we had to identify the outcomes, right? We had to gather evidence of what's going on. We had to interpret that evidence, and we had to impact change on the fly at all levels. So how would our students learn? How did we know that it was our students who were taking the courses, right? How do we move a traditional face-to-face course to an online course? And again, at the institutional level, how do we support this learning, given the enrollment mix of our students? Some of our students may not have had the technological needs or access to that information to be able to learn effectively in an online environment, right? So we implemented this assessment cycle real time in real life situations, right? So in that, the pillars of assessment and outcomes are indirect and indirect assessments, as Dr. Burns said, that he'll be speaking to what happened in indirect assessments. And I think Dr. Bass will give you some context of what happened in the indirect and direct assessments when you go through their case study examples, right? All this is grounded in the terms of our learning goals, right? Our learning goals is, and I contextualize this from a learning goal when you're doing a course transformation process, right? What is the goal of your course, right? Is it learning? These are the questions that we should always have to ask ourselves, right? Is the purpose of your transformation, right? What is the purpose of your transformation? Is it grounded in better learning, right? Do you want to be able to answer these questions for your students? Are your students learning more and mastering the content? And I think, again, under the context in a COVID world, right, how is that happening in the multiplicities of how we're delivering content at our various institutions? And in that, the 4 pillars of the questions that I think we should all be asking ourselves is, what do we want our students to know? What should they be learning, right? How are they learning, right? How do we know if our students are successful in learning? How are we assessing that learning, right? And how do we know that it's better or improved, right? Again, these are questions that we should constantly ask ourselves at those 3 units of analysis, from a student perspective, from a course perspective, and also from an institutional perspective. Now we'll transition to the Middle Georgia case study.
We have an open access university, so we have about 8,000 students, so we get very well prepared students, but some that are not well prepared. And the Department of Psychology teaches Psych 1101, which is the intro to psychology, about 1,500 students per year. And we have about 25 faculty. So that's the context of where we are working. Next. And so I apologize for this. This slide was supposed to be a little bit funnier because our heads would move and it would make a sound. But when we integrated the PowerPoint, it doesn't make those effects. So there were two of us who were chosen to do this. And so we started our project. So there were only two faculty who actually did assessments, baseline assessment before the intervention. Next, please. Oh, that's the music. Okay. All right. Now, based on some guiding principles of successful learning, when we were redesigning, we decided to part of the question of one of the pillars is how do students learn? And so based on the National Center on Academic Transformation, we found some guidelines, and one of them was to encourage active learning. And there are several activities that you can do to increase active learning. Provide students with individualized assistance. That is a, we lost the presentation. And when it comes to the individualized feedback, that takes a lot of time unless you get creative and find a program that provides that kind of feedback, immediate feedback. And we were lucky to find one program that provided students with exercises, activities that were related to student learning goals. And they would actually do some of the exercises and they would get immediate feedback, and to the point that it would direct students to the specific page in the textbook that they missed, for example, one specific question. And so they would get another opportunity or several opportunities depending on how they answer, because it comes in levels when you ask for hints, or you don't get any hints, or you just get, or you want the answer. Depending on how you answer, the program itself gives them more questions until they master the content. Okay? And so that is a wonderful program that we have, that it came with our textbook, except that it requires a lot of adaptation and modification to actually tap into the content that you are choosing for a particular chapter. So it's not so simple. It requires a lot of work. And then this is part of the ongoing assessment and prompt automated feedback that they receive, in addition to the general assignments that we do normally, which include quizzes, tests, partial tests, essays, etc. So you can, next. All right. So part of the big charge was to de-emphasize traditional lecture delivery format. And both of us, apparently Dr. Vick, who is our dean now, and at that time was our chairperson, knew, I don't know who told him, that we were very traditional lecturers. And so he targeted us on purpose, I guess. And so we had to de-emphasize traditional lecture, using class activities, at least one per unit, to encourage student engagement and understanding. And also, he wanted us to change the textbook, or at least think of a textbook that was more affordable. And we were able to strike a deal with a publisher company that is one of the most famous textbooks, but they gave us a great deal because almost all of the instructors who teach Intro to Psychology were going to adapt that text, so they brought down the price, where they make it very affordable to students. And then we went for online textbook, and so that helped. All right, so that was part of the redesign. Next, please. And so we started the implementation in the spring of 2017, and we did 4 semesters, full semesters of assessments. And we ended in the fall of 2018 with about 274 students that were assessed. And we use both direct and indirect assessments. The direct assessment, I will not talk about the direct assessment because there is a publication coming by the UGS Gateways to Completion G2C that explains more the direct assessment in detail. I have to tell you that we didn't get significant results in terms of our intervention. Dr. Food, who was playing the role of an editor, was gracious enough and open-minded enough. I have to give credit to the Gardner Institute that allow us to present something that in a way contradicts all the principles that we are trying to implement, and it didn't work for us. And of course, we have some hypotheses why it didn't work and what we can do, etc. But today, I'm going to emphasize on the indirect assessment part. So the indirect assessment part has to do with assessing the content of what we created or what we decided together, the whole faculty department, thought was a good way of learning. And so we incorporated a class icebreaker the first day of class. We used the active individualized immediate feedback that is called Learning Curves from the publisher, which is a wonderful learning tool. We did group activities, including application of concepts, class demonstrations, so to increase active learning, some assignments where they have to write their own results to interpret what it means to them, to increase what psychologists call semantic encoding, which is applying meaning. And supposedly when you apply meaning to what you are studying, you tend to retain more and encode more. And we did, of course, the traditional class discussions to increase critical thinking. We provided the PowerPoint in advance at the beginning of the semester. We, of course, use in-class videos. And we, of course, incorporated as well extra examples provided by the instructors to illustrate some concepts and make it more amenable to different students with different learning strategies. So we did all that. Now, the question is, after doing all that, did that really help? And how did the students perceive those exercises and those extra resources that we gave them? And so we created our own. This is not part of the Gardner Institute formal assessment of student learning. This is our own. We wanted to tap into the content, the specific content that we, in terms of the pedagogical methods for learning. How did the students perceive it? So this is the question: how helpful do you find the following activities? And so one of them is the learning curve activities in Launchpad. That's what they call it, you know. What about group activities? And we were very specific. What about class activities to demonstrate specific content like open learning? And so we provided the example so it would give them a cue of what we were referring to, like clapping for the hot and cold game. So we did some games, demonstrations in class. Next. Thank you, Richette, for helping with moving. I think it got stuck. So the next page. So all these are content of pedagogical tools or methods or tricks, whatever you want to call it, to increase active learning, increase participation, increase deeper learning. I mean, that's the whole theory, the whole hypothesis here. The class demonstrations on this and written work on several activities. So we even asked, what about the PowerPoint? Did that help? What about class discussions? What about the use of short video clips? And we provided some examples so to cue again what we meant. And the last ones, I think, is 2 more questions that we asked. Can you please move it to the next slide? And what about the examples that your instructor provided? And so here is the results. Thank you. Now, notice what students thought that was more important to them for learning. The examples provided by the instructor, the PowerPoint, videos, and discussions, pretty much. And learning curve was pretty 4.3, and then started going down demonstrations, which requires a lot of preparation. We thought it was going to be ahead, was much lower than a PowerPoint. Written reports and group activities are not liked by students. Well, we don't know exactly what it is. Is it that they don't like it, or is just the perception that it didn't help them in learning? So there's more to investigate why they didn't like. Well, I kind of get an idea why written reports were not so liked. They were very small written reports. And the group activities, very simple group activities, but they were graded at the end because they have to turn in some responses. So we have some speculations why they didn't like. Now, this is important because this feedback. Now, are we going to insist in our own perception of what really helps students, or are we going to work with what students think that helps them in the learning process? And that's a question that I really never asked myself, because I think that I know what my students need, you know. But apparently, no, they don't like written reports. So there are different ways of bypassing this problem if you insist that that should be the way that they should learn. So this is a very complicated part of the cycle. When you assess, now you find some information about how they responded to your teaching content, and then how you refine it, or do you change it, do you modify it? So next, please. Now this one was an extra kind of 2 questions that we ask. If you noticed, most of the assessment questions that are used by the Gardner Institute tap into what we are doing for our students. They don't tap of what students are doing for themselves. So we were curious about how many hours are they really spending. So we asked them this question: how many hours a week are you spending studying for this course? And I said, outside class time, not including learning curve, activities in Launchpad, because this learning curve can take longer if the students are not reading, are not really engaged in class, then they will not be able to answer these questions. And they have to reach a number of points in order to pass that assignment and acquire a certain percentage that makes them have an A, for example, in that assignment. So some of them take a little bit longer. So we wanted to know, besides that, what else are you doing on your own? And then the other question that we were curious is, how much responsibility they assign to us, that we are responsible for the grade? Now, this is what we were tapping. Now, Dr. Big pointed out, well, we don't know exactly what they understood about this question, but this is the intent of the question. How much do they think we are responsible for their grade? Okay, these are the results. About these 2 questions, and the other ones I mentioned them already. So can you move them? Move the next slide, please. So how many hours a week? The prior one, please. The prior one is how many hours? About 82% spend 3 hours or less per week studying for a class. That's highly telling, by the way. We can do everything in class, but if they are spending 81 or 82, I mean, if you do an average, is 80 something, 82.3, 83%, that's an overwhelming majority are spending less than 3 hours a week. So the next question, which also is a puzzle for me, for us in the department is, to what extent is the instructor responsible for your grade? For the grade, I think it's missing the grade you get in this course. And so again, more than 50% said that the instructor was responsible, or more. Some even said 100% that we are fully responsible. So this gives us a lot of way to think about how are we going to adapt for the next wave to improve our learning outcomes, the process of learning, and us ourselves adapting to what this data is suggesting. Of course, again, I have to tell you that we don't know exactly what is the meaning that students are assigning to this question, but it's something that we have to ponder about. And I think that's at this stage is all that I need to say about our results for the indirect assessment.
So I guess I will start now, and Dr. Hines, I will just say next when I'm done with the slide. So I hope that I can explain to the point about authentic assessment, and want to talk about what we have done about authentic assessment in our redesigning program at University of North Georgia. As I have already said, I teach mathematics, so our gateway to completion course was college algebra. And I just want to say one thing, that I have absolutely no formal training about mathematics education, so my presentation is going to lack formal terminology, and I apologize for that. So assessment for us is in the redesigning program, we kind of thought like it's threefold. So if you categorize very broadly, it will be assessment of the course topics, learning objectives, and the learning outcomes. And the second one is the assessment of the student preparedness, formative assessment, summative assessment, and finally assessment of the retention of the knowledge for a student who has successfully passed the college algebra class and now is placed in a subsequent class. And thirdly, I thought like this is most interesting that I have learned during this process, that we need to assess ourselves as instructors about our instructional pedagogy. So our team is of 6 members: Thomas, Clay, Nam, Alejandro, Marnie, and I. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So the University of North Georgia started the Gateway to Completion program as a part of cohort 2. And our committee took charge in fall 2018. The first implementation of the redesigned course occurred in fall 2019. Next. So UNG has 5 different campuses, geographical campuses, and the 6th one, as we like to say, is the online campus. So in 2019, 2,726 students were enrolled in college algebra classes, and we offered 90 sections, and that's only fall. And there were 5 tenured or tenure track faculty, 10 non-tenure track full-time faculty, and 11 part-time faculty teaching these classes. So 80% of us were teaching 2 sections of college algebra. So please go to the next slide. We started the process of assessing the course by asking ourselves a question: what is college algebra? And to seek the answer, among other things, we first went to the University System of Georgia's guidelines about college algebra. We did the same thing with University of North Georgia guidelines. And to our surprise, we learned that there is pretty much no correlation between these 2 guidelines. System is saying something, we are doing something. Then what we did, we initiated a faculty survey as part of our redesigning program, beginning of fall 2018, and we gathered information from all the instructor teaching college algebra at that time. And to our surprise again, we learned that the third party, the instructors themselves, we were doing completely a different thing, what we thought is college algebra. The final source of information came from the Gardner's Learning Gains survey. It helped us understand the students' perspective about the class, what they expect, what they think, what they want to accomplish at the end of the semester, when or if they successfully complete the course. So In the next slide, I basically wanted to talk about the key factors of the survey process. So once we have collected the survey results, we compiled and evaluated the data we collected, and we identified the key indicators from the administrator's points of view, the instructor's points of view, the student's points of view, and we started creating a vertically aligned structure for this course. The structure had well-defined timeline, proposed learning objectives, and paired with appropriate assessment question that both qualitatively and quantitatively measure the learning outcomes. So there is a link for you to access and the assessment, vertically aligned assessment, and with the questions and things like that. And in the next slide, I have an example for us to see what type of question. So among other things, we asked our instructors to submit their final examination from the previous semester that they have taught college algebra. So just to give you an idea, one of the questions that we have in the faculty survey displayed on the slide, that all UNG faculty have access to the shareable drive called U-Drive. And the question said, the following course objectives appear in the U-Drive syllabus folder for the college algebra in fall 2017. Indicate the relative extent to which you believe the college algebra accomplishes these objectives on your campus. And the objectives were very broad, course level objectives sometimes. So we said after completion of the course, the student will be prepared for further work in mathematics, able to represent and solve real world problems and applications of mathematics, exposed to the technology that enhances understanding in mathematics. Also, we had more technical course level objectives, such as able to apply distance and midpoint formula, able to set up, solve variation problem, etc. And the faculty were choosing between the options of never accomplishes, seldom accomplishes, often accomplishes, or almost always accomplishes. And what was striking and almost paralyzing to me at that point when I realized that I actually had no proper guidelines or description about the course level objectives that I'm going to go in a class and teach. And there was so much not uniformity that we were seeing. And I started thinking how badly our students are feeling when from us who are clueless. And so what we did, Dr. Heinz, if you can go to the next slide. So we captured the entire idea and put it in this vertically aligned table that we created as a model table. And it's just an example. As you see that it has, the structure has one week objective, in what week we are expecting what to do. This one is talking about week 7 and 8, and we're going to talk about quadratic equations. And it comes with the proper guided learning objectives. For example, student will be able to analyze quadratic functions and interpret domain and range and vertex of real zeros in the context of algebraic and graphical processes. And one other thing we spend a lot of time is understanding the significance of proper vocabulary usage, because we have a very diverse community of student as well as faculty. And most of us were using terms that we have learned in our textbooks that probably our student doesn't associate very well with. And we also had to maintain the very balance between what we are supposed to say in a classroom and what we are not. So we kind of gave a clear, distinctive approach for our instructors as well as our students to know the vocabulary that will be used in a particular section. And finally, each section came with, which we felt is a pretty exhaustive list of suggested questions that kind of complemented the learning objective and then hence otherwise the outcomes, learning outcomes. So I have a couple of examples. So as you can see, each of these questions that we asked in homework quizzes or tests are tagged with specific learning objectives. For example, I have this example from the section of quadratic functions and equations, and this is the objective 5, and that is solving applications of quadratic equations. A particular example talks about terminologies, defining a quadratic equation and solving it. So the student and the instructor both knew what they're grading or what they're answering and what is the general expectation. So, and if we go to the next slide, then there is a similar example, and it's from the same learning objective. And to those of my colleagues who teach mathematics, you would know that this particular quadratic equation, you can use it for any projectile motion. May it be a punter punting the ball, or kicking a field goal, throwing a ball, or motion of a rocket, or throwing fireworks, shooting fireworks. But I used a picture of golf balls, and the background of the story is that we did a survey at the beginning of the course, and we asked, among other questions, what are 3 of your favorite sports? And I would be honest, I was very surprised because the answer for my class was golf. And I decided to just put in the picture of golf and make it a problem about golf. So as simple as that. And that's the only thing we did in the redesign program that is rather different from, I think, from the other redesigning programs. So the next slide, I pretty much talked about the assessment of the topics in a little bit of relation with the student outcomes. What else we did for the student outcomes? We have done pre-assessment. So each of our student, beginning of the semester, for the first 2 days, they took a pre-assessment written by our team. And we wanted to do the assessment for our students in this pre-assessment, and we wanted to basically implement this pre-assessment for entering college algebra students, and keeping in mind that we want to understand our student body a little better, mostly where they stand. We thought, instead of complaining about how our students did not learn anything in high school, we would rather try to bring them to the level that we want them to be on the first place. And so the process is very general, and it's should be very flexible. It depends on what is your student body. So from the pre-assessment data, we determined somewhat broadly a picture of the skill sets for our students. It helped us create a semi-individualized lesson plan that addresses the strengths and the weaknesses of our student. So we also created 6 major course themes for our college algebra class. So in the next slide, I have kind of have those course themes. It's basically as simple as domain and ranges, symmetry, intercepts, transformation, piecewise defined function, composition function, and inverse function. Because this class is about functions, each function you can relate with these course themes. And what helped is, I think, we adopted a special grading scheme, and probably most of you already do that. We were not doing it. So during each test period, irrespective of what learning objectives we are testing, we incorporated questions that were reflective of the learning objective, aligned with the measurable learning outcomes that addresses these course themes. So the students knew which test questions are targeted to which course themes, and as well as the instructors. So when we graded, we adopted the grading system that automatically replaces the student's performance in a specific course theme by a better performance in the future period. So one of the primary goals in college algebra, as we understand, is focusing on the retention of the skill set for a student that he or she develops in a college algebra class, so that they can use it in their next subsequential class. So we adopted the grading policy based on the course themes, not to penalize, rather to reward the student for mastering the concept by the time they are completing the course. So if you have done badly or poorly on a course theme in test 1, but you have done better in your course 3, you are okay. I'm not going to penalize you for your bad work in course 1. That was the essential bottom line idea. So Dr. Heinz, if you can skip the next slide and go to the next one. So to help our instructors kind of identify and relate to this process, we created a flow chart, and it's basically helping them understand the grading scheme and their lecture styles. So the flow chart basically associates the broader course objectives with the course themes and the interconnection and interrelation between these themes. So the next slide, please. So one other feature on which we spent a lot of time was generating the procedure and the tools for interpreting and the evidence, and devising a measure for understanding the student learning outcomes, and recording them in both the qualitative and quantitative data collected from the assessment questions, analyzing, interpreting the data in context. So we used the data to devise, measure our success, and then identify our failures, and basically had a better plan to make a better plan for the next semester. So the next slide talks about the student data were basically dependent on quantitative data, which were collected from the summative and formative assessments like pre-test, midterm, final exam, homework quizzes, and the qualitative data were collected from student discussion. And it was done in two ways. It was either the mandatory weekly discussion that we hosted in the learning management system, or the after test one-on-one meeting between the instructor and the student to discuss their progress as it reflected in their tests. So I just want to go over a couple of examples, and in my next slide I have those two examples. So those of you who use Top Hat, you probably understand now that I use Top Hat, but I'm pretty sure you can do it with any learning management system. In fact, we recently started making our things in WebWork, which is a free software. It is going to take some time, but we are planning to do it. So this is a simple question of solving a linear inequality and then graphing it. So as you can see, it's kind of a temperature schemed. It's a heat wave type of thing. So the students mostly picked the third option, which is the correct option, negative infinity to 2. So right before I go to my classes, I just go over, show the correct answer and show responses of my students. It helps me know my students a little better. And if I feel like my students did not know about it very well, I go to my classes and talk about it. So the next example is actually a little interesting in my mind. So this is a question from solving linear equation. And the question asked about, you solve the equation, then identify whether it's an identity contradiction or a conditional equation, and accordingly write your solution. So at that point, only 24 of my students took the homework. And what I realized, all of them solved the problem right, and they understood that all real numbers are the solution to this equation, and they answered R. But less than half of them actually related that to the right idea that it should be an identity, not a contradiction. So what I did, I actually went ahead and in the next class, I told them, hey, think about this. When you call something is a contradiction, if you have two statements and they're not matching with each other, you call it a contradiction. So if the two sides of the equation are not equal, they're not matching with each other, it should be a contradiction. An identity is when you stand in front of a mirror and you see yourself, that's an identity. So identify that as having the two sides of the equation always being equal to each other. So call it identity. So it kind of gave them the perspective. So what I realized that they knew how to solve the problem, but if I asked them to have that problem in a real life situation, in a context, they will not be able to do it. And to my surprise, after having this discussion, when I gave them a similar question in the final exam, not only they answered both parts right, they actually explained why they think that that should be the right answer. And I was thoroughly impressed about myself. I patted myself so many times that I did something right. So if you can go to the next slide, so basically this is one other thing that we identified opportunities for improvement after the fall 2019 semester. And we also re-evaluated the themes a little bit and implemented and improved those things in the spring 2020 semester. So next slide, please. So this is a little bit of data analysis that we have done. So the first table that you are seeing, it is the pre-test versus the post-test data. So if you just look at the mean, then the pre-test is around 19%. Is the score that we were getting from our students, which I think improved to 60. I would call it improvement, almost 64% from 19% to 64. And that was a big boost for us, and we really felt well. And the second table talks about the university-wide, campus-wide analysis of the DFW and non-DFW. And we found out that it was a little less than 20% for the pilot sections in fall 2019, and that were in DFWI category. And for the non-pilot sections, that number was more than 25%. So we had a significant low number of DFWIs, and we were 1/5 of the total number of college algebra students in our pilot sections. So in the next slide, I have the histograms that kind of helps us understand the skewness of the two graphs. So the left one is the pre-test histogram, and as you can see, as the scores are increasing, there are less and less number of students, which kind of helped us understand that the students probably are not there yet, prepared for the college algebra class. But if you see the post-test, it is what you want to see. That's pretty symmetric. It's a bell curve, so pretty normal distribution, and we were very happy about it. We also did a little bit of regression analysis. And so in the next slide, I have 3 regression and curve fitting examples for you. So the first one is expectation regression analysis, and it is best fitted as linear regression. So what it essentially tells us that the result we obtained in fall of 2019, if we keep doing this thing and let us improve on our own perspectives, then 83% of the time we're expecting to see similar improvement. And the post-test is even further better, and it is best fitted as a quadratic linear model, I think a cubic polynomial model, and it talks about 93% of the time we are expecting similar results as we have seen in fall 2019. And so the essential question were, so maybe our students were all very good that we were having in the pilot section. So we did the polynomial regression, and that is the best curve fitting for this result that we have found between pre-test and post-test. So the question was, maybe our students were good. To start with, they were very good, but we actually found out that only 9% of the reasons of variability, how a student did well, if they did well in the post-test, was depending on their pre-existing knowledge. So that led us believe that our redesigned program, this assessment process, probably have some merit to it. I'm not saying that we are done. We're not even close to be done. We have to do so much work. And the final thing that I wanted to talk about is faculty assessment. And basically, I want to tell you about a very small story. You can go to the next slide. Dr. Williams asked me whether I would be willing to present. I locked myself in a closet and said that, why me? And then immediately I thought, like, I'm behaving exactly like my students. When I asked them to come to the board and do something, they would say that, no, not me. So I felt like, no, I have to do it. Even if I do a terrible job, I will learn from others. So that is where my idea of faculty assessment comes in. So we started doing peer evaluation. It's very friendly. We say mean things about each other, but we do not take it to our chair, not in our annual evaluation. It helped me personally more than I can imagine. I do it all the time. I go sit in my colleagues' classes, learn from them. We highly recommend a departmental level pedagogical training for our faculty. And finally, we recommended teaching hours for gateway level classes that are almost nowhere. No one gives credit to these faculty, these instructors that teach these classes that basically shape our students' future. And so we recommended that there should be faculty awards every semester for doing a good job. So that's precisely what I wanted to say. I will give you back to Dr. Hines.
Dr. Hines, you may need to unmute.
Okay. Good afternoon. We have about 5 minutes left. We definitely will share the slides. The last section of the slides were just some questions and pointers that you should think about around assessments, but I don't want to lose the two powerful examples that were presented in from our colleagues. One, thank you both for having the courage to share and open up what happened on your campuses with your various courses, one from social sciences, one from the STEM areas. So with about 5 minutes left, I would like to open up for questions. One, I want to point out that in both examples, you saw the authentic assessment, what authentic assessment truly becomes. I think in the second example, it was powerful for me to hear the question about the quadratic equation, where each student, if you were measuring it on a test, each student got the answer correctly, but they did not know how to apply it to a real world application. And from an assessment standpoint, is it important that they can identify it on a test? Yes, but it is critically important that they can take that and move that to a real world assessment. And I think that was able to be illuminated because of the pre-work that the department took in terms of looking at itself as a department, realigning the course to the 6 pillars, even as something as powerful as in the quadratic equation example, a myth would have been that I would have had the data myth that students wouldn't have been watching golf. So to use the golf ball example to relate that to our students to help them learn the concept, I think it's all the multiplicities and the continuous aspects of assessment. So I'll open up the floor for any questions that we may have.
We had a hand raised during the presentation. If that person, I only saw initials. If you'll unmute and ask your question, please. My apologies for not getting to that person faster.
Okay. Oh, so we only have we're right up on time. I know we're right up on lunch. We're 5 minutes away. So I'll let my colleagues, co-presenters have any closing remarks they will have to give to the audience.
You're
Go
muted.
ahead, Josh.
Go ahead, Irvin.
Okay. Well, I think the most intense work is when you are redesigning your course. But I think the more complex question is, once you have the assessment, what do you do next? Because even just how students interpret the data, I don't have an answer for that. I know how I interpret the data because we designed the questions and we thought we were asking this, but sometimes you get surprises because the meaning that students assign to a question is very different. I have that experience when I'm reviewing, for example, some items in the direct assessment when we have our partial exams. And I think that I made myself understood in a question and students misunderstood the question. So what do I do with that? And what do I do with this level of responsibility that they have? Is that actually a part of the targeting learning that I need to do from the beginning of the course to increase a sense of more responsibility in them, to own more their own learning? So and what exercises will I modify? Will I do things differently? And we are, by the way, doing things differently. We introduced teachers' assistants that are in the classroom, which are almost peers of intro to psychology students that got an A in the class, and now they can serve as peer tutors. And that's what we are experiencing with right now to see, because in the direct assessment, it showed that students who were less prepared, who came less prepared with lower scores on SATs were the ones who were getting lower grades and were not making too much progress. So that's the part that is, I think, more complicated, more heart-wrenching for us as instructors because we care for our students.
Great. Well, we're right at 2 minutes, so I want to thank you all for joining us. Again, if I don't leave you all with anything, let's think about the multiplicities of assessment. Let's think about assessment at, not only understanding what is best for our students, but then how do we help to continually to learn about our about the course, and then how our institutional learning helps provide an environment that supports the course learning, support our faculty, and support our students. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.
Okay, thank you so much. And many of you are already saying congratulations and thanking our panelists. Dr. Dash, you do have a question in the chat, so if you don't mind checking the chat, so if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it. And
is that Shreyash? And I think I answered Shreyash's question. Is that the one?
I think that is. I think that is. Thank you.
And
So thank you.
just want to say one more thing about probably I did not talk about it, but I think assessment for at least for college algebra is very important to not lose the track of your students. Just because they have passed your class, it doesn't mean that your assessment process should end there. What we started doing, we are following the students that got out of our pilot classes and in their future physics, chemistry, or math classes, and we want to see how they're performing there. And if they are doing better in those classes, then and only then probably we can say that we have done something. Otherwise, the process is incomplete in my mind. That's all.
Okay. So the questions are continuing to come into the chat for this group. I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, use a few minutes of your lunch and see if you can answer those.